Hello and welcome to this presentation on WinJS, or the Windows library for JavaScript. I do assume that you have looked at the earlier video or presentation on the WinRT or Windows runtime. This video is a continuation, or sort of the next phase, if you will, from that video. So we won't be looking at WinRT over here, even though we might be using, of course, parts of the WinRT. The idea is to focus this presentation primarily on WinJS. So the WinJS is essentially your gateway into the Windows RT application. So, oops. So through WinJS, you have access to the WinRT APIs, the file system, various other pieces of the WinRT API, and also the Windows IE DOM, if you will, the HTML DOM and other JavaScript that you're typically using. We'll be focusing primarily today in the sort of the WinRT side of things. That is not just the WinRT aspects, but also the WinJS library provides a lot of features and functionality in addition to access to WinRT. Features like XHR and promises akin to jQuery, if you will. So that's what we're going to be looking at in today's presentation. The Windows WinJS is comprised of course, multiple toolkits, as you see here on the screen, and we're going to be looking at some of the toolkits in today's presentation. We'll be looking at the WinJS core, not directly, but sort of indirectly, of course, since the core is used in pretty much everything else. And then we'll be looking at building our own user controls using JavaScript or WinJS again, and looking at binding that control using code as well as the declarative syntax that's available to us in the WinJS libraries itself. After that, we'll be looking at using some of the Windows 8 personality controls, such as the AppBar control, and we'll also be looking at implementing the search contract in the sample application that we are going to be building in this demo. So without further ado, let's get started with the code. So what we have here is just a blank project. What I've essentially done is I have gone into File, New Project, and under the JavaScript applications, I picked Windows Store app, and then I've picked the blank application. So once we have that, the JavaScript that was created for us in the default JS was a bunch of JavaScript, but I've just cleaned that up. If you've seen the other video before this, the one on WinJS promises, I kind of explain what's happening in that JavaScript, but nonetheless I'll do that again in this presentation, because this is actually the sort of the first part, if you will, of the WinJS series. So typically in JavaScript, everything that we do, let me just zoom in here. Everything that we have, every line of code that we write in JavaScript is essentially global, as in it's not contained within a namespace, or it's not private or public. It's just all global, it's all public. And so good practice in JavaScript dictates that we write our code in anonymous functions. And these anonymous functions, of course, they don't have a name, and they're self-contained, or they're contained within this confines. So everything you write inside of these methods is kind of private within these methods, and they're self-executing in this case. So this function is kind of is automatically called, and so it's self-executing or self-invoking function. And so anything we do in this function here, which could be other functions, classes, and so on, they're all kind of contained within this function. So I'm going to first initialize the variables I need in order for this application to run. So what I have in my Solution Explorer here is I've got a project called Custom Controls, which is the current active project, and all we're doing right now is we're starting to build out this default JS file, which typically comes with a lot of JavaScript in it, but I've kind of cleaned it up and start with a clean slate. So define a variable for our application, which comes from WinJS.application. That's a reference to the application instance at this moment in time. And then we want to hook into our application's onActivated event and assign that to a function here. And once we have that, we can get our application to start. So the idea is that if you have other events you want to hook into, you want to do that prior to calling start. And so this is going to be the sort of the entry point, or this is where the application is going to start. And from this point forward, now what we have is an anonymous function that is self-executing, that is going to eventually execute everything in here. And so we have an instance of our application. We hook into our onActivated event, and then we start the application. Now within this anonymous function, everything is sort of private or is contained within this function, but there may be reasons or situations where you might want to expose either classes or functions or variables outside of the scope of this anonymous function. In other words, they can't be anonymous. They need to be named in a certain way that you can reference them from outside. So in WinJS, we have the opportunity to define namespaces, and within namespaces, types of variables. And so what we're going to see is a bunch of, or in this demo, we're going to be defining a user control in a certain namespace and a person object in a different namespace, and so we can access them or reference them using the complete the qualified name, which is the namespace plus the name of the classes or methods or variables. And then in our HTML file as well, we can look at referencing those classes and variables and methods using the namespace. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a user control in a certain namespace here. So in WinJS, we have the option to define a namespace. Now the namespace could just be one string, so it could be just that. Or in this case, I have the matlas.controls as a namespace. So when I reference this, anything in this namespace, I'll reference it as if it was like a dotted namespace. So it'll be matlas.controls.vcard in this case. So that's how you define a namespace in WinJS. And over here, you're seeing me define a class. So this is, instead of define namespace, I'm defining a class. And all I'm doing here, this is a constructor function for a class. Those of you familiar with jQuery plugins or making your own jQuery plugins will recognize that the element is the element into which you wrap your control. Typically, it's a div. I'm not going to try and explain to you how to define controls here. It's not so much about the mechanics of defining a control, but it's more like, okay, we can define controls in WinJS and we can use them and bind data to them. So that's the sort of the point or the purpose of this demo here. But if I look at the HTML for this, what I have is a vcard. Now it's just a div. And what we want to do is, to this div, we want to add various HTML elements that will help us display certain information, in certain styles. And so this control is going to take that div as its sort of the element, and then it's going to build sort of sub elements, if you will, child elements inside of this element to make it a little more fancier as a control as we would know it. So that's essentially the purpose of this. So it maintains a reference in this dot underscore element to this element here, and it has a back reference to element dot win control to be itself here. This is we'll see the importance of this later. Typically, every WinJS control that you define will have a back reference, or should have. If you want to be a good citizen of the Windows 8 family, then you want to have any controls you make should have a back reference assigned of yourself, assigned to win control, the dynamic property win control. Options is nothing but a bunch of name values, or an object that contains names and values. Is sort of not whole over, but it's basically looking at how jQuery plugins are done, where instead of sending a bunch of properties, and then if you have to add more properties, you have to change the signature here. You just have one object that has a bunch of name value pairs, and that with the signature, the constructor does not change. So once we've got these references here, we call this method build visual tree, which is here. And then this build visual tree, what we're doing, as I said when I explained earlier here, we're going to add an h1 element, and we're going to add the h1 element inside of the div. So essentially, if you can imagine, this div is going to will look at runtime something like this, and there's another div in here. So there's an h1 and there's a div. If you look at this closely, we created a title h1 variable that's really an h1 tag, and we append it to the element. Then we create a div tag, call it email div, and the text decoration of the div is underline, and then we append that also to the element. So essentially, we've got the original element that has an h1 tag and a div tag, and this div tags, if you can imagine, style, text decoration, underline. That's really what we, instead rather than doing this in HTML, we are doing it in JavaScript code to build our own controls without cluttering up the HTML here, which is how some of the WinJS controls that we'll be looking at later are implemented. This vcard also has a person property, and this person property in this case is an object, and it has a getter and a setter, so it's a read-write property, if you will. The person object itself is defined in another namespace, matlas.models namespace, and just you know, there's no real reason for it. I just wanted to show you how we can have multiple namespaces and multiple objects in different namespaces, and how you can reference one from the other without polluting the global namespace. So in this case, the person class has got a constructor that takes in two parameters, a name and an email, and essentially just it assigns internally to its name property the name variable that came in as a constructor parameter, and the same with the email. So this is the standard sort of JavaScript object concept, prototypical objects rather than class types. And what we do here in this property is when we set the person, we just assign it to the sort of the internal variable, in this case this person variable. When we get it, we return the reference over here. But when we set it, we of course we set the internal variable to the value that came in, and then we assign the text content of the h1 to the name, and the text content of the div to the email. So as soon as you set a person property on this vcard object, what it's going to do is sort of display the information about the person in the vcard, right? So that's really what's going to happen. So on app activated, this is what we had, you know, in the earlier scenario, where this is where the application starts. So when the application starts, what we want to do is we want to create an instance of a vcard. Or first, let's create an instance of person. So I'm going to have a person that is nothing but a new matlas.models.person, and this takes in these two parameters. That is not my email address, but you can try that. Okay, so that's a person. Now I want to create an instance of this vcard, right? The vcard takes the element, which in our case would be the div that's in our HTML page here, this guy, and some options. At this moment in time, we're not doing anything with the options itself, so we don't care for the options. So what we want is a vcard div that is nothing but document.getElement by ID, right? That's the div, the vcard div in the HTML page. And over here we have a vcard, which is nothing but a new matlas.controls.vcard, and this vcard takes in this element. Let's call this vcard element, and in this case options, we don't care for anything. Once we have an instance of a vcard, the vcard has this person property, right? So we assign the person to that guy. dot person equals person. And what we should see when we run this application is that we should see the display showing up by the control. So that's the h1 tag here, and that's the div tag that has the underlined style text declaration here. So that's it's showing up. So that's one way to define, controls and use them. Let's see if there's another way to do this. So in WinJS, rather than create instances of these controls yourselves or ourselves, what we can do is we can do this sort of declaratively. So what we can define here is data.win.control, and we tell this the runtime that we want this control, which is mattress.controls.vcard. So that's mattress.controls.vcard, right? That's the control we want. And let me take this guy out. So this vcard, now somebody has to create an instance of this control. And in WinJS, we have this, in the onActivated, we essentially have, let me redo it below. We have WinJS.UI.processAll. ProcessAll is essentially going to process the entire, depending on what you send here as a parameter, the entire document, and process all of the elements that have a data.win.control attribute, and then it sort of instantiate that class, if you will, or that object. And that's what ProcessAll is going to do. ProcessAll also is a promise. So then we do a then, and in here, I don't know if it gives any parameters, but nonetheless. So once ProcessAll is completed, we would now, that page, if you will, has been processed as far as the data.win.controls are, or data-win-controls are concerned, and we would now have access to this some instance. So rather than have an instance of this vcard created by hand, I want to use the instance that was created by this ProcessAll. So the way we do that is we do the same thing. We get the vcard div, but at this point we want to treat that div not as a div but as a win control. So that's remember that back reference we had here? This win control, nothing but the control itself, in this case vcard. So for the C# folks, the way I see this actually is almost like saying you're casting this to a win control. It's almost like as win control. In JavaScript there's no concept of casting, so we just have a .win control. This win control is nothing but a vcard. So that's a vcard, and then to this vcard we could assign the person to the person, right? So all we've done is we've not instantiated the control by ourselves. We are using the sort of declarative way of defining a control, which is kind of the easier way to do it, and then we do a ProcessAll that will ensure that that control has been instantiated. We can then reference it by finding it in our document. I don't know what to call this, but casting it or getting a reference to the win control in this case. So it's not really a cast, it's a reference to the win control. And once we have the reference to the win control, we can assign the property. And then as soon as we assign the property, we know what it's going to do. As soon as the property gets assigned or set, it assigns the h1 and the div to the values. So there'll be no change in the output, but the way we got there was slightly different. So that brings us to the conclusion of the second demo, which was on controls, WinJS controls and binding. And now moving on to, this is a fun little project here. It's pretty cool. Now this project is nothing but a continuation of, let me make it the start project here, continuation of our from the previous video on WinRT. Let me just run it and show you what it does. It's doing nothing spectacular, but it looks pretty cool because it's got all the movies in there and all the groupings as we had earlier. So what I want to do is do a few things. I want to implement the AppBar. I want to implement the search contract and show you how all that works out here. So let's get started with that. Okay, so to implement the search contract, it's pretty simple. It's a nice way that they've implemented this or exposed the API. Now the project from the previous version, which was in C# is slightly different. So let me just run through some of the things that we're doing here, or that have changed. First of all, I've left all the JavaScript as it is, so you see some of the mess. But essentially, as you remember, after this process all, which is a promise, we do a then, and then we do our thing here. So what I've done is I've got a download movies async method, which is implemented in JavaScript here instead of C# from the previous previous videos demo. And this is downloading a JSON of all of the movies from my Azure site. Comes back with a promise essentially. So it's returning this async, returns a promise, the WinJS over here, and what it's returning is the movies as an array, right? So we get JSON asynchronously from my Azure website, then convert that or parse that from JSON to an array of movies, and what is being returned is another promise with the movies, if you will. Okay, so get download movies async returns to us an array of movies. And what I do here, so I'm not returning this yet, so let me just finish that. It so happens that the JSON has capitalized or Pascal cased properties. So the item.title, the T is uppercase, so the style is Pascal casing. So all of the properties of this object are Pascal cased, and so what I'm doing is, just to be consistent with JavaScript, is I'm declaring another items array here, and I'm essentially pushing each of the movies into the items array, and I'm just redefining the property name to a camel cased property, so it's title and so on. That's all it's doing. You see, nothing fancy, and then I'm returning items from this method. So download movies async returns items, and because it's asynchronous, we do a then, we get the items that are being returned, the value that is being returned asynchronously, and we assign those items to the list view. So that's the other method here, and this is nothing but what we were doing in the last time, except that we assign the items to a binding list. A binding list is nothing but an observable collection or an observable array, if you will. So in WinJS, the binding is like a two-way binding. It's kind of like doing the implementing the iNotify property change interface in XAML, Silverlight, but you want this two-way binding. So as things are removed and added, you want the UI to be to reflect the change, and vice versa. If the UI has changed, you want the data to be synchronized with that. So that's what the binding list is. This movie's binding list is declared sort of within this function, but kind of not, it's not local, so it's within this anonymous function. So it's not global, but it's available to us outside. And I create grouped, sort of a grouped data source that is grouped, and that's what we're seeing, the grouping by genre. And so we assign the two item data source. We look at this whole list view and how to work with the list view in a later episode. For today, we're just concentrating more on the search features, implementing the search contract and the AppBar. So I don't want to get too caught up. I just want to explain this concept, though, that we've broken this method into download movies async, assign to list view with the items. Okay. Now, so that's what's making this application function as it is, which is movies in grouped by genre, and these movies are a bunch of movies here, and well, hang on, these movies are not. So what I wanted to see, you can look at the year of the movies here. It's 2013, 2011, 9, 1998, and so on. So I want to just sort these by year. So let me clean that up. So instead of, before we do the group, you can say create sorted, and create sorted takes in a function that gives me it's like any other sorting function where it returns less than 1, 0, or 1. So I can return here x dot year minus y dot year. I should sort it ascending order. Okay, so I guess it goes this way. So this is the order. It goes down, then comes up, goes down, and so on. So all these movies are now, so 1941 is the first one here, and so on. So the year. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to now implement the search contract. So to implement the search contract, I'm just going to uncomment this code out. The moment you do this, you have implemented the search contract. That's all it takes. So windows.applicationModel.search pane.get for current view. So the search pane is if I went in here and I did a search, this pane here that you're seeing here is the search pane. Okay, so that's the search pane. So depending on what's going on currently, the search pane.get for current view is getting me the search pane, for that view, for this page that I'm on, the HTML page. That gives me a reference to the search pane at that moment in time, because you can keep calling the search pane out and it's maybe a different instance or different reference. So once you have the search reference to the search pane, you can now hook into its on query submitted event by defining a function with the args, and this args, so query string is nothing but args dot query text. So let's just call it query text. Okay, so I'm just going to put a breakpoint here. What I want to do is eventually I want to be able to search for all movies from the year 2013. So start that, type in 2013. In case you haven't used the search feature in Windows 8, what it does is it allows you to search for this value in any of these applications. So it's not limited to your application. So you can search for this in this text here in any of your applications. We're going to search for this text in our application. So by default, it selects it. So we come in here, you can see that the query text is 2013 here. Now, of course, we want to filter it using this 2013. We want to filter our data set here. So we could have just what we could do is we could do the same thing we did in the startup. We don't have to re-download the data, but what I'm going to do is just copy this over just to keep it simple. Ideally, want to look at the same data and just filter it, which you can do, but for now we're just going to look at re-downloading the data. And when we get the items here, rather than assign that set of items to the list view, we're going to filter this item. So for I equal to items.length, right? And we say if, define another variable, let's call it results, which is an array. We say if items of i.year is equal to query text. I want to redeclare this. I'll just do that. So if it's equal to query text, then we will say results dot push items of I. Right. Once we're done with that, we assign to the list view the items, the results. So we should only see a subset, and that should take care of the search implementation. Of course, if you wanted to search on title and genre and all these things, you would have to figure out what you intend to do with that. Is that a number? Is that a title? Is that a genre? And search accordingly. Right now we're just assuming that the only thing we can search on is a number, so we want to make sure we only assign or send in years in our case. So if I pick 2013 again it shows me all movies. That's not right with all something went wrong here. Let me flip back. Okay, right, that's instead of a boolean compare we assigned it. So now let's see if that works correctly. Pull up the charms, search 2013, and there you have it. See, we've now been able to filter out or search for all the movies that were made in the year 2013. And that's a pretty cool capability, isn't it, to be able to hook into the sort of operating systems API, play it nice with other applications. So you can actually do the search not just within this application, but pretty much any other application. You could search for 2013 and, you know, at Bing, you could search for 2013 in music, you could search for 2013 in your application and so on. So that's really the neat part, is you can take the same query text and then fire it across multiple applications, and your application could participate in that search. So that takes care of the search contract. Now let's look at the app bar. The app bar is, if you look at this another Windows application, Windows 8 application here, the app bar, I'm going to right click and it pops up this app bar. So there's two halves of these buttons. There's a set of buttons on this side and there's a set of buttons on this side, and they have a meaning. But the idea is, if you're touching, if you got a touch device, then you can just sort of swipe in from the top or the bottom of your screen, or from the device. If you're using a mouse, you can just right click on the mouse and that'll open up the app bar. So going back into our application, in our HTML page. So this is the HTML page. What I'm going to do is I'm going to define a new div, and the data.win.control for this div is going to be AppBar. Now app bars have various command buttons, if you will. You know, the buttons that you can pick off of the app bar. So what we do is essentially you define another control. I'm just going to copy it from here. In this case, it's a regular button, except that it's been converted to an app bar command, and it's got a bunch of options. Let's look at each of these options so you can see it. Nothing spectacular, but nice to know that you have these. Typo here. Okay. So we have the add icon. The icons are in WinJS or in Windows 8. They have the Sego fonts, and the icons are, there's a bunch of fonts, bunch of icons that are just fonts. So you can use them directly. So all of the Windows 8 standard fonts for save and add and delete and all these are part of the symbol font for Sego. And in this case, we're saying we want to use the add font icon. Oh, sorry, the add icon from the fonts. We want the label under the button to be called add movie. The tooltip to say click here to add a new movie, and the section in this case is global. That's the right hand side section in the app bar. Okay, so we're not doing anything with the clicking of this command, app bar command, but at least we'll see this thing function, see it appear. So now I'm going to right click on with my mouse here, and you'll see that the app bar appears, and there's a add movie label, and the tooltip here says click here to add a new movie. Nothing's going to happen when we click. It's going to error out because there's no add movie method here. So it says here add movie is undefined. So let's go fix that. Now within this WinJS, this default JS file, we are in an anonymous self-executing function. So in order to be able to make something visible on the outside, what we can do is define something in the namespace. So we're going to do that. We're going to say WinJS dot namespace dot define. Let's call this search. Doesn't matter what we call it for now. And the next parameter here, actually, sorry, my mistake. I actually prefer it like this, so I can see the what's going on. Okay, so we can, what do we call this? Add movie. So you have a function here, add movie, which is a function that has an implementation, right? And in this implementation, what we want to do is we want to add to our movies binding list. Remember, this is an observable list. So as we add and remove items from it, it'll actually notify the UI, and the UI will react to our adding and deleting from this list. So we want to add to that list a movie, and I have such a movie that we don't already have in our existing set. So in this case is Man of Steel, which is the new, at least at this moment in time, the new Superman movie that's currently running in the theaters. And I've got an image for that here, and I'm going to add a new category that we don't have. In this case, our genres, action adventure for the year 2013. And let's close that out. So every time you click, not every time, in this case we can do it only once, but when you click, it calls this add movie function that essentially is just pushing into the binding list a new item with the title of Man of Steel and so on. Of course, over here in our HTML, what we want to do is say search.addMovie. So see how the namespacing allows us to reference things inside of the namespaces, yet not polluting the global namespace. Okay, let's see what happens there. So we run this application, we right click. So the action should appear either in between here or between here. So when I add a movie, keep an eye out on this. See, notice the animations that take place as well. This is pretty cool because a lot of the stuff comes for free. You're not having to write all the programming and animations and all the stuff for you for your applications. The list view is already doing that. So all we've done is done the programming, and all of these subtle animations, the hovering, the selections, none of this has been programmed by me in this application. It's just part of the function of the list view in WinJS, which we'll be looking at in the next episode, but I just want to highlight that to you. So when I right click here, I'm just saying add a movie that adds the new Superman movie to our binding list, and that automatically is updating the visual, in this case list view, and it comes in with animations. So look at the animations as well. So there it goes. Now we could add it to, like, say, an existing genre. So instead of a new genre, we could add it to an existing genre. So let's do that. In this case, instead of adding this to action adventure, let's do that. And if this were, let's say, 1913, which is like not possible. What I want to show you is that not only will it add it into the existing genre, it'll add it in the right position because that list is sorted by year. So let's see what it does there. Okay. So now it should appear over here, and it should appear as the first one, not the last one, somewhere there. So let's see if it does that correctly. So you see that again with the animation, and it's coming in order, in the correct ordering or sequence. So that's the beauty of working with the WinJS controls that come out of the box, is that they already have all of the behaviors, animations that are required of the Windows 8 style controls. You just have to write the programming to get this thing done. So that brings us to the conclusion of this episode, where we have looked at defining our own user controls in JavaScript or WinJS, doing binding in code as well as declaratively, and then looking at implementing the search contract as well as some of the Windows 8 application controls, such as the AppBar control. So if you haven't already seen the next episode, which is on the WinJS promises, please do so. And after that episode, we'll be looking at an in-depth look at the WinJS list view control, including templates, binding, and various other capabilities, grouping and such. So I'll see you guys next time.